In this video, we are going to talk about analytic philosophy. And if you have not watched part one of this video about continental philosophy, watch it first. So, analytic philosophy. Um, Essentially, just as with continental philosophy, it starts with Immanuel Kant. And it's primarily taking place in England. All right, so analytic philosophy is, you can say Anglo-Saxon philosophy, English speaking, with two major exceptions of Frager and Wittgenstein, as we're going to see soon enough. So, in England, a couple of decades after Immanuel Kant, we get this genius thinker, economist, psychologist, philosopher, John Stuart Mill. And he came up with this, he did a lot of work in, different areas. I mean, he was just insane smart. So when he was a very little boy, when he was like 2 years old, his father, began teaching him ancient Greek, ancient Latin, Plato, and Aristotle. I mean, he was like so learned, it's just hard to imagine. I mean, it's like by the time he was 6, he read all of Plato and all of Aristotle in Greek. I mean, it's just crazy. So, John Stuart Mill is our first major analytic philosopher. So he came up with this doctrine which is known as psychologism. So he wanted to answer this question: what is logic? Okay, so what is logic? It's this kind of doctrine about thinking. That's what logic is. And he says, well, what is the origin of it? And the answer that John Stuart Mill gives is we get logic out of psychology. So essentially, the laws of human thought is why we have logic. So essentially, logic is derived from human sort of human thinking being correct. That's his thesis, and that's the analytic philosophy thesis. And John Stuart Mill was very sort of empirical in his approach. Kind of rejected all these sort of Hegelian concepts and metaphysical concepts. Pretty empirical in his approach. And this is, pretty typical of, analytic philosophy, is that he was pretty boring to read for the most part. I mean, some of it is really interesting. And, that's one of the major differences between analytic and continental philosophy is that, 90% of analytic philosophy is just boring, okay? There are some exceptions. I mean, sometimes it's fascinating stuff. Bertrand Russell, some passages in Wittgenstein, I mean, just incredible. But 90% of it is just boring, okay? So, John Stuart Mill. And then we get to our next major analytic philosopher, and that is Gottlob Frege. Frege. That's how you spell his name. Pretty tricky. And he was a German speaking philosopher who he was actually primarily a mathematician. And he wanted to answer the same question that John Stuart Mill asked, and that is, what is the origin of logic? Where do we get logic? And Frege totally disagrees with John Stuart Mill that we get sort of logic from psychology. He totally rejects it in his texts, such as Begriffsschrift, which is translated into English as concept notation, and in his philosophy of arithmetic. So Frege essentially does not think that laws of logic derive from the laws of psychology. They are objective, you can say. They exist out there, and they're sort of like Plato's forms. They exist in this sort of abstract realm, but he was not a Platonist. And Frege's work was largely ignored when he was alive, but it was revived by our next major analytic philosopher, and that is Bertrand Russell. Okay, Bertrand Russell is, a super interesting man. He was a British aristocrat. He lived an incredibly interesting and rich life. He witnessed both world wars. World War One, World War Two. You know, uh, he was friends with Wittgenstein. He just a very active life. He lived to be close to 100, and he is a heavyweight analytic philosopher, one of the most important um, analytic philosophers without a doubt. And he, first of all, brought Frege's work to the why. He brought attention to it, because like I said, it was ignored, and Bertrand Russell revived it, and he said, well, that's incredible stuff, we should look into it more and develop it more. And he did something kind of mean, mean at a personal level, but if you're interested in the truth, you gotta do it. He did something, which devastated Frege, and that is, he wrote a letter to Frege. Bertrand Russell wrote a letter to Frege, and he asked him this, seemingly simple question. Frege wrote a lot about this concept of set. There is an area of mathematics known as set theory, and Frege talked a lot about sets and sort of he clarified a lot of concepts, using this, something known as set theoretic notation. And Bertrand Russell asked him this simple question: well, what about the set of all sets which are not members of themselves? This may seem like a, pretty, confusing. Sets which are not members of themselves. Like what the hell does it mean? Well, to give you an example, a barber who cuts people's hair, but he only cuts the hair of those people who do not know how to cut their own hair, you can say. Like, for instance, I am a barber, and I am willing to shave your face, okay? However, I will only shave your face if you do not know how to shave your own face. So, you do not know, you come to me. And, now we get this paradox. Well, what about me, myself, as a barber? Do I shave my face or do I not? Because, if I don't, then it qualifies me as a customer, for my own services. And in that case, I will shave my face. But if I shave my face, the condition was I don't, so we get this paradox. And, kind of Frege was devastated by this letter from Bertrand Russell, and he rejected pretty much his whole philosophy. Very few people are willing to do it, and he kind of said that, the whole project I, embarked on is, kind of flawed, and I think most of it is, just a mistake, major mistake. And Bertrand Russell felt bad about it. He said that, I kind of, it's one of the greatest examples of academic honesty, the way that Frege reacted, but essentially he said, his work is good and it can be sort of advanced and developed and improved on, sort of taking some things into assumption. So Bertrand Russell wrote a very significant paper called On Denoting. Okay, that's where, the basis of his, analytic philosophical theories are on denoting, in which he describes sort of what it means to, denote he uses a lot of abstract math. That's why I'm not kind of getting too much deep into it, because it's pretty dry, pretty abstract stuff. And Bertrand Russell wrote a super hard book. It's actually perhaps the hardest book ever written. It's in 3 volumes. It's called Principia Mathematica, and in humankind's history, as far as I know, okay, 3 people have read it. Just 3 as far as I know. It was Ludwig Wittgenstein. It was Kurt Gödel, one of the greatest logician ever, arguably, and myself. Like I read the whole 3 volumes, and I have like a pile this big of pages. If you guys want to see it, I can post it, like kind of go into Principia Mathematica more in depth. So super abstract work. Just it's hard to even say what it's talking about. It essentially summarizes all of mathematical logic, all of analytic philosophy. It does calculus, it does geometry in this sort of mathematical notation, which is really hard to understand. And there is this famous sort of example on page I believe like 300. I forgot. I read the whole thing, but I derived it myself, some of it. He takes half a page to prove that 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, and there is a whole bunch of other incredible results he elucidates and proves. So Bertrand Russell. So just to make sure you guys are not lost, let me kind of recap so far. Kant, he is our kind of origin of the split between Continental and Analytic traditions and philosophy. After Kant, we get John Stuart Mill with his theory of psychologism, which was rejected by Gottlob Frager. Then we get Bertrand Russell. Right. Our next major philosopher in the analytic tradition is a fascinating philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein. Okay. He lived an incredibly interesting life, which is pretty unusual for philosophers. Like for instance, Immanuel Kant, he lived his whole life in one city. I mean, can you imagine like just living your whole life? And he lived to be like 80 years old. Like you live for 80 years in just one little city. I mean, that's his life, not super interesting. But Ludwig Wittgenstein had one of the most interesting lives in philosophy, for sure. He was, without a doubt, one of the richest geniuses who ever lived, together with Charles Darwin and ancient Greek philosopher Seneca. These guys have been just insane rich, okay? And Wittgenstein was a son of the biggest steel manufacturer in Austria. So essentially his father, was making steel, and pretty much all construction companies, transportation companies, they did business with him. So, I mean, like he had so much money, it's not even funny. And what's even more crazy is that he gave up, like, large part of it just to, for instance, he supported a broke poet. There was this poet in Austria, and Wittgenstein just liked his poetry. He just gave him like an insane amount of money. I mean, yeah. Can you imagine how happy the poet felt? It's, even better than winning a lottery. Like, it was insane money. So, Ludwig Wittgenstein, very, like I said, very unusual and interesting philosopher. In addition to him being super rich, he also volunteered to be a soldier in World War I. And, that is just crazy. I mean, first of all, he could have died. Second, he could have been an officer, like an officer, or even perhaps a higher ranking, military official. He did not have to be a soldier in the trenches, but that's what he voluntarily chose to do. And in the trenches during World War I, he wrote much of his revolutionary work known as Tractatus Philosophico Logicus. All right, it's a very small book, just like 60 pages. You can read it in 2 nights easy, and it's one of the most obscure works in philosophy. And analytic philosophy has this kind of reputation for being clear. It's like you read Frager, Russell. It's a bit boring, but it's clear. They tell you, that's the assumption, that's the hypotheses, and it's pretty clear stuff. If you understand the logic behind it. But that's absolutely not the case with Wittgenstein. Even though he's writing about logic, but I mean, his this little work, his Tractatus, it's incredibly vague and hard to understand, and it just, it's written in these Twitter-like sentences. He just, writes these short sentences. 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and they're so intimidating and vague, and it's just pretty hard to read, Wittgenstein always. And this work, Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, advances a lot of ideas, first put forth by Frege and Russell, and particularly, those ideas of logical atomism. That's sort of Russellian, concept, sort of how what are the basic logical units of we can kind of work with. And Wittgenstein says it's a fact, like the world is made out of facts, not objects. That's one of the first sort of major theorems he states in Tractatus. And then he works it out, sort of relationship between facts and sort of mental states and a whole bunch of interesting stuff. And he essentially concludes his Tractatus with a statement which goes like this: whereof one cannot speak, one must be silent. So essentially, human language can deal with some questions, with some domains of existence, but with some things it just cannot talk. Like it cannot be coherent. It cannot literally make sense to an extent, and you should just be silent. And later on this was interpreted as sort of being metaphysical, but Wittgenstein did not clearly say what it is. He said, if you cannot talk about something, don't talk about it. Okay, because you cannot talk facts about it. But there is kind of a twist to this statement. So that's Wittgenstein, and later on, okay, much later, like 30, 40 years ago, he wrote a second major work known as Philosophical Investigations. And that book largely rejects his views that he put forth in the Tractatus, this kind of logical atomism, how kind of we can break things down into these basic, facts which we can, analyze. He kind of rejects it for a more holistic, and you can say for a more continental picture, in which, we just have language games. Okay, so that's the main concept from Wittgenstein later philosophy. That is the concept of a language game. So for Socrates, things, not things, words had clear definitions. And most of Plato's dialogues, they go like this. There is some guy, he says, well, this is what justice is. And then Socrates comes and he says, well, are you sure? He's like, well, let's look at the concept of, justice, look at it from this aspect, look at it from that aspect. And, he kind of, in Plato, there is this kind of belief that, words have clear definitions, they have specific definitions, and, philosophers, it is their job to clarify those definitions. And Wittgenstein disagrees with this. He says that, there are just linguistic games. So different words just get used in different language games, and for instance, the word, classic, like what is classic? In the historical language game, classic means, Greece and Rome. in the, let's say, musical language game, classical means, well, Mozart, Beethoven, stuff like that. What does, classical mean in the literary, linguistic game? It means, sort of the writings of ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle. That's classic. So, there is no definition for the word classic. There are just different language games in which you can play this word. All right. So that's, Wittgenstein. Who is our next major analytic philosopher? It is Rudolf Carnap, Carnap. And he belonged to what is called the Viennese logical positivist school. So it was super hardcore empiricist philosophy, essentially. So it said that whatever cannot be verified by experience is nonsense. It's not that it's vague, or you cannot have a clear concept about it, or that you have work it out. No, it's just nonsense. And they took this last sentence in Wittgenstein's Tractatus, whereof you cannot speak, one must be silent, and they applied it to metaphysics. They said a lot of philosophers literally speak nonsense, especially those kind of grand metaphysical philosophers such as Hegel and Spinoza. They speak nonsense because they try applying language to domains which language is not equipped to work with, and that's why you get nonsense. Literally, it's outside of sense. So that which language is equipped to work with is sense, and anything outside it is nonsense. So that's Carnap's philosophy, very reductionalistic and very positivistic. So it's known as logical positivism. This kind of and he did use like a lot of sort of mathematical notation, but that's the basic concept that if it's not within sort of the allowable linguistic domain, that it's nonsense. All right, that's Rudolf Carnap. And the last, well, no, actually, I'll have two more probably. Next, we get Quine, okay, an American analytic philosopher. And, his philosophy was essentially anti-Carnapian, anti-logical positivism. Not really anti, but it really kind of challenges a lot of these logical positivist concepts. So Quine published a paper about this sort of hardcore empiricism, and how they claim to use language just for applicable domains, and he really says that there are logical mistakes in these assumptions. So by the way, the name of this paper is called Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And he really kind of I think successfully kills logical positivism. And to a large extent, modern day physics, kind of really agrees with Quine's philosophy. Like, for instance, these subatomic particles. I mean, like those, quarks and neutrinos and, string theory. I mean, have any of you ever seen any of that stuff? I mean, if you haven't taken drugs, I don't think you have. So, even though we haven't seen a lot of these things, I mean, they still kind of make this indirect sense. They kind of fit into this explanatory picture, and that's what matters for Quine. This kind of coherent theoretical framework into which a theory fits or does not fit. So that's Quine, pretty smart, clever, philosopher. if you listen to his interviews, he's like not super interesting to listen to, but um, his writing is very, very beautiful. He's a really good writer, and that's one of the reasons why he got so popular. I think because he's just such a pleasure to read. And finally, let's get to the most recent analytic philosopher, and that is Sol Kripke, an American Jewish philosopher, um, and he he wrote a book called Naming and Necessity, which essentially um, wants to go back to some of the questions that Wittgenstein was trying to ask, and Bertrand Russell, and essentially he builds this theory, which talks about sort of what it means for something to be necessary versus something to be contingent. Like we talk about, something is necessarily true. Like for instance, like the sum of, all angles in a triangle must necessarily add up to 180 degrees. Well, that's sort of true no matter what. And he, kind of asks these questions. What does it mean for something to be necessary versus something to be contingent? And he works out this mathematical model, which uses model theory and set theory, and he is our last major analytic philosopher. So once again, to summarize this two episode lecture, continental philosophy is primarily German speaking and French philosophy, which talks about being and history and human existence, with major representatives being Hegel, Kierkegaard, Marx, Nietzsche, Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, Lacan, Derrida. And analytic philosophy is much more, you could say, dry, mathematical, scientific, and it asks questions such as what is logic, what is mathematics, what is language, can we sort of talk about things beyond our sensation, like what is certainty, what is validity, what is true, what is necessary. So that's what analytic philosophy deals with. And a lot of philosophers, they kind of overlap, like Derrida, he was interested in analytic philosophy. Continental philosophers such as Husserl, they were very analytic in their approach. So it's not always a clear-cut distinction, and I kind of feel like there is a lot of unnecessary hostility, between these two camps, and it's unfortunate. So that's the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy.